There we go. And let's begin. So housekeeping, we're going to have you all on mute, but we are happy to answer questions as we go. Please use the Q&A tab to ask a question, and I'll keep my eye on it and throw them back and forth between Matt and I. If you would like to ask either host a particular question, please just identify whether you're directing it to Matt or I. All right, so let's begin. I'd like to start with just a contextual overview of the last 5 years. This is a map from Nimity Research last year that basically identifying the strictest spam control of anywhere in the world. Like this is where the hottest is obviously the red with the consent map, and then it goes to orange. And you can see that Canada is one of the hot spots in terms of the strictest controls on consent. And then if you flip to the benchmark report from IBM, as far back as 2018, there's been a significant shift in that 5-year period since CASL came into play, where Canada has jumped. Canada and Australia, two of the strictest consent law countries in the world, have some of the highest open rates. So I want to connect those two things, and Matt, I think you'll agree, but I believe CASL is working.
Yeah, Derek, I studied the same thing just after the law came into force, and I saw the same results where metrics had improved across the board, not just open rates, but click rates, reduction in spam complaints, sort of just general improvement around marketing metrics in the email space for at least the 3 years that I studied directly after the law came into force.
Yeah, I think if we had a method for tracking, Matt, during that period, we would have also seen lists get smaller, but engagement go up.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily saw lists get smaller. I actually saw volumes go up as well. There was certainly a shift in targeting, but I don't think it didn't slow down mail at all.
All right. So I'll open by introducing myself, Matt, and then I'll allow you to do the same. So I'm president of I'm actually chairman now of the Response Marketing Association, and I also am the managing director for Newport Thomson. Newport Thomson, we help organizations come into compliance with all of these data protection and privacy laws around the world, such as GDPR, CCPA, our own PIPEDA and CASL. I'm also a member of the ISO 31700 Privacy by Design for Consumer Products Committee. We are a group of 10 Canadians on a global committee who are actually writing the ISO standards for privacy by design. I've written a book called CASL Compliance, a marketer's guide to email marketing to Canadians, trying to really zero in on what it is we need to do because of CASL. And I'm a certified information privacy manager from IAPP. Matt, I'll allow you to do the same thing.
Yeah, so I am also on a number of different committees as well. I'm a CIPPC, which is a Canadian Designated Privacy Professional from the IAPP. I have founded the Canadian Email Summit. I chair the Email Experience Council out of the US. And I wrote a book a long time ago called The Complete Guide to Email Marketing under Canada's Anti-Spam Legislation, as well as I've been writing my own website, emailkarma.net, for over a decade now on email marketing and best practices.
So I should have added the founder of Canadian Email Summit along with Matt. We founded that together. So yeah. Great. Suffice to say, I think we have a lot of expertise on the panel today to answer any questions. So let me start out with an overview. I want to go to 30,000 feet here on CASL And there's really two ways to deal with CASL. You can either strictly obey the law, or you can implement a compliant program. And I want to distinguish the two opportunities for you, or the two ways of dealing with CASL. So first off, the obey the law, doing the minimum. So the new rules are simple. They're to be able to prove consent before you send an email, include full transparency when you're sending every message, and have a working unsubscribe in every email. Those are the general kind of changes to the way we used to operate. We used to just do whatever we wanted with email, and now suddenly there's some rules in place. They're not particularly hard to follow, but the record keeping around it can be difficult, given our previous legacy systems were not set up to track and prove. So we'll get more into that a little later in the presentation, and we'll show you some tips and tactics for setting up your and these are based in real life clients. So we're giving you some examples we've actually implemented. So proving consent, let's just talk about that for a second. You know, I kid with our clients saying no tiki, no laundry, and it really is that. If you don't follow these rules for what the CRTC considers express consent, for example, or implied consent business relationship, you could find yourself with a fine. So email lists are now require a modest investment, and more important, they must be done one at a time. We can't scrape the internet anymore. And in terms of processes, the chances are your processes are out of date. You never had to track this stuff. How do you make changes without replacing the entire data management system? We think we can show you a few ways without completely redoing your technology. I want to start with this though, and Matt and I both agree on this, that when email marketing started in, you know, maybe the late 90s, 1998, let's use that date, the prevailing marketing mentality was from a mass marketer. We were used to more is better. It was all about eyeballs. And it's that same management, it's that same marketing management that started to use email marketing. So it was only natural that we applied a mass marketing mentality, a mindset, to email marketing, which led us down a path that really, if you think about it, and Matt was on that initial committee forming back in 2004 to form CASL, before it was even named CASL. It was 1998 to 2004, the government, in 6 years, the government saw that we were abusing it. Collectively, as a business community, we were swamping people with email. And I truly believe that came from our mass marketing mentality, where more is better. And what we've learned in the 20 years is really that engagement is what matters. So it's not all about eyeballs; it's about engagement. This is a direct one-to-one medium, and we need to treat it differently than the rest of our promotional tools. And I assert we don't. As we get involved with clients, what we've noticed consistently is they start out claiming they have consent, but as we ask them to prove the various consents, most can't. And if you cannot prove how somebody got on your list and why they belong on your list by meeting one of the measures that we'll talk about, is you need to trash that part of the list. So there's a lot of people still emailing people from 10 years ago, and the justification is something like, well, they haven't unsubscribed. Well, not unsubscribing is not consent. I'll say that again. Because people don't unsubscribe, you cannot assume consent under this current regime. Consent is far more detailed than that. So I
So
just noticed. Yeah,
Derek,
go
I have
ahead,
a
Matt.
question
Somebody
here.
asked a question. Yeah.
Yeah, the question is, if you cannot prove consent, can you run a re-permission program to ask people to opt in, or do you just have to let it go? So under the legislation, the CRTC is defined, or CASL has even defined, I should say, that asking for consent is considered a form of commercial messaging. So if you can't prove consent through some type of either existing business relationship or existing non-business relationship, you have to be able to have one of those sort of check boxes ticked off before you can start asking for consent even. In a recent example, a large retailer here in Canada with a loyalty program and multiple different brands under that, I've opted out of their email in general, but because I went and shopped at one of their other brands, they actually just sent me a, hey, you're missing out. You should opt into our email messages. That would be a violation because they're sending a message that is considered to be a CEM without consent, because I've withdrawn consent previously, asking for consent. So it does get a bit, you can kind of talk around in circles around some of that, but you need to have at least one type of implied consent at a minimum before you start to message people. We're going to get to the definitions of consent in a few minutes.
Yep.
We'll answer the next question that came in on that when we get to that slide, but thank you for answering that.
For starters, though, I will answer that. What's the definition of consent? This is express consent, and the requirements when you're collecting express consent is you have to clearly identify who you are and include your mailing address. So there can't be any ambiguity about who is sending the message or who you're opting into. You need a clear statement of what to expect when you opt into this list. You need a contact name with two ways to reach them. For example, email, web address, or phone. And you need to state that you can unsubscribe at any time. If you have all four of those elements when you're collecting express consent, you're pretty rock solid that that is going to be considered express consent by the CRTC. But if you're missing any one of them, you leave yourself open to the possibility that CRTC might look and go, that's not express consent as we defined it. So all the way along, you're operating like you've been collecting express consent, but it's your version of express consent, not the CRTC's. And the fact is, the CRTC is the one who can fine you. So I think it's just wise to collect it as they've laid it out.
I would say, just on top of that, Derek, that's probably one of the most common issues I see when working with clients or working with brands, is they believe they have express consent, but somewhere on a form that was created by somebody on their web team versus their email team, one of those elements gets missed.
Or more than one, yeah. I agree.
Yeah, or more than one. So you end up with a situation where you believe you have express consent, but based on what your form actually looks like, you're actually collecting an implied consent.
You're correct. I put an example up here of what that previous slide, those four elements, actually looks like in a paragraph. So this is our Newport Thomson email sign up. And it ensures that if somebody does sign up, that indeed we've included all four elements. So we're pretty confident that this is express consent. If somebody's signed up using these fields, and you'll notice that we put the language right beside it so that there's, again, no ambiguity. You don't have to scroll down to the base bar. And it says, yes, please send me information on data privacy and email compliance in Canada, Europe, and US from Newport Thomson, our address. I can reach your chief privacy officer at, in this case, we actually named a contact, and you can name a person or a role. And this can be a link, but given the format of the way our web form is done, we didn't require a link. We could just put it in the paragraph. And then I know I can unsubscribe at any time. That's pretty simple. And it's amazing to both Matt and I how many web forms we come across that don't do this. And if you don't do this, you're probably not collecting express consent. You think you are, or you're counting it as that. And just be very careful. Take the time now to get all your web forms with the correct paragraph, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. Do it once. So again, just to reiterate, no scrolling. So if you think that your company name and address is in the base bar and it's way down the page, you've got to scroll forever for, the CRTC has within their rights to say, no, that's you're burying it. Also,
this
go ahead.
is really interesting to note. Like if you have an infinite scroll page, as an example, where you can never actually reach the footer, consider that as well, because I've seen that before where, privacy policy, postal address, and that type of information is at the bottom of an infinite scroll. So you can never actually reach it, which is certainly something that needs to be readily available for your consumers to be able to access.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I will, we're talking about compliance here, and compliance is the minimum standard. So often we'll recommend to our clients to go above and beyond, to actually take care of your customer. Like forget what the law says, what's right, and revealing who you are and giving them, being fully transparent is just the right thing to do. So I do want to distinguish that compliance is the minimal standard. Best practices are actually above the compliance level set. So again, no small legal type, don't bury it. Don't make it hard to understand, and don't make it disappear in 5 or 6 point type. And then the fundamental is include all 4 elements. Why put 3 of the 4 when you can actually just do it right? So I'm seeing another question come up. Yeah, that's a great question, Kent. If the unsubscribe link information is in small type or hard to read, can that impact compliance with CASL? And I would say, on a case-by-case basis, CRTC would weigh in on that. But yeah, if it really is, like I see sometimes it's like in really light gray type at the bottom, and it's really small type, and so yeah, I would suggest that in some of those instances, CRTC may say, we don't like that, so make that more prominent.
It's important to note that the CRTC wants the unsubscribed links to be readily available, easy to access, easy to find, easy to execute. There is actual case law where they had a brand that had a 8 or 9 step unsubscribe process, and they found that brand to be in violation of the legislation. So burying the unsubscribe link, making it hard to find. I've seen examples where brands will have the link, but they'll remove anything that makes it look like a link in their footer. They'll put light gray on white text to make it hard to read. And especially as we have an aging population, people tend to find harder to read fonts. So make sure you're using a reasonable size font as well for all of these things, and you're not hiding the links. So anything you do that could be viewed as trying to trick somebody into staying on the list or make it extremely hard for them to be removed from the list is going to be something that the CRTC is going to review. They may send you a warning letter first to say change your practices. But if it is egregious enough, they will send you, notices of violation, notices to produce. They have multiple different sort of enforcement tools at their availability where they can, try different things at first to bring a brand into compliance before they issue penalties.
Good. There's another question is, I'm assuming that the compliance language can't be linked on another page, i.e. the view the privacy policy. I would suggest that the 4 things that we outlined should be clear. The thing that you can link is the contact, and Matt, as a standard policy, likes to have his clients include the privacy policy in that link in that paragraph as well. I'm going to show you possibly the next slide. No. There's a slide coming up here that I'll show you a really good footer, email footer.
Derek, one of the questions here that I think is important to understand is, do you have to have a checkbox or is the submit bit button clear enough? And I think
Yeah.
ECCC has issued guidance on this, and a lot of it does come back to sort of what your brand is comfortable with. They have issued that there should be some type of toggle, but what they've also said is toggle could be a very clear statement that says, by clicking this button, you are going to give us consent. And when you reach the content of the form, having the required information on that. So like this form, it doesn't necessarily need a checkbox, because by clicking the button, it's very clear that you're going to be subscribing. So, I would make sure that your statement around that is very clear as to what the action the individual is going to be taking.
Yeah, the position we take on this, Matt, is that is the positive action required? So consent must involve a positive action on the part of the consumer. The positive action is actually putting my name and email address in here, so I don't need the checkbox. If I'm registering you for a webinar and I would like to also get express consent, I would need to put a separate checkbox with this language. And in 2 different transactions, one you sign up for, you're filling out the form, but it's to sign up for the webinar. Separately, the checkbox would be required if I'm using that as express consent to have you join our email list.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's important. I think that's
right.
important to differentiate too, is you can't bundle the statement, right? So
Right.
You can't
Right.
say, by clicking this form, you're going to create an account and subscribe to our newsletter, and we're going to put you in postal, and we're going to do these other things.
Right. Right. Exactly.
It can't all be
Yeah.
one checkbox. So you have to have sort of that clarity in regards to what the person is actually consenting to. So there are some situations where I would recommend checkboxes when you're trying to do multiple actions, such as sign up for the webinar and sign up for newsletters, versus simply, taking the opt-in all at once, which would not be an express consent, but you could say there is an existing business relationship, implied consent in that situation. So it kind of comes down to what you're looking to achieve in regards to the type of consent you're collecting.
And we'll get a little more into that when we talk about the 5 types of consent a little later in the presentation.
Yeah. The next question is a bit of a follow-up to that. So I would say, if you have an opt-in for partner on a webinar, having a separate checkbox for your brand and your partner's brand to say, I want to hear from, in a situation, we'll use this webinar as an example, right? I want to hear from Response Marketing Association. I want to hear from Newport Thomson, and I want to hear from Matt at Email Karma, right? So those could be 3 separate checkboxes to allow full transparency and allow the consumer to decide which of the options they want versus opting them into sort of all 3 brands.
Good
Hopefully
distinction. Yeah. So we're going to switch modes here, and we're going to talk about when you're sending email. The bottom line when you're sending is full transparency. Who's sending? The sender must be clear, and the sender must also be the owner of the consent. How can I reach someone? Every CM sent must include the name and address. Now I'm talking about footer information now. 2 ways to contact the person and a working unsubscribe. We recommend that you include a link to your privacy policy. This is what I referred to earlier.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of the interesting part here that sort of builds on that is um, the definition of what a commercial electronic message is broad enough that it also includes transactional messages. But so transactional messages must also include footer information such as postal contact info and a unsubscribe from future commercial messages. However, if you're sending things like password reset, gift card codes, those are exempt from consent. However, they must also include an unsubscribe for future commercial messages. So there is a bit of a differentiation to look at. Which also confuses a lot of what I would, marketers that follow sort of the can spam, mostly transactional with promotional content. As soon as you add promotional content, that message becomes a clear commercial electronic message that requires full consent and the ability to unsubscribe from future commercial content. So it is something that I see trip people up. So definitely just be aware that there is no idea of mixed messaging under CASL.
We pretty consistently recommend to our clients that if you treat all company emails as CMs, it's a lot easier to train your staff and for them to understand what is and isn't, and you can get caught up in that minutia. And we just take the basis. If it's a business email, just treat it as a CM. Include all the information in the footer. No big deal. So again, compliance to the law versus best practice, right? You got to work that out for yourself. But I think if you were on somebody's email list, you would appreciate if they would include this information in every email they sent you. Just for CRTC purposes, I just want to make sure that everybody's clear. A working unsubscribe is within 2 clicks, 2 weeks. It does not mean it has to be automated. The Response Marketing Association, we just have a line at the bottom that says, if you wish to unsubscribe, please hit reply and type remove in the subject line, and we will remove you from the list. It can be that simple, right?
The other important differentiation between, say, CASL and can spam is can spam says it must be processed within 10 business days, whereas CASL's wording is it must be processed without delay, but no longer than 10 business days. So the idea is to be as expedient as possible instead of waiting a full 2-week cycle to unsubscribe someone under the legislation here in Canada.
Yeah, I think the thinking behind this is sometimes we have emails in queues and scheduled to be sent, and to go in and scrub a name is just unreasonable expectations. So they're basically saying don't queue your emails for more than 2 weeks in advance. Here's the footer that I talked about. This is from IT World, and it stood out to me because it was particularly thorough. And this is if you actually go into your email service provider, really, no matter which one you're using, and set this as your standard, and make sure that you force it to go into any email sent by the system, including your own one-to-one emails, by the way. That's another area that's always seems to cause a bit of controversy. A CEM can be a one-to-one email as much as it is a bulk email. And most people think that CASL is just for bulk email, and it's actually not. It's for all commercial electronic messages. So when your salespeople are sending one-to-one emails to you as a cold calling tool, it's actually illegal under CASL to cold call using email. You must have you must be able to prove, I'm gonna watch my language. So having and proving are different things. You have to be able to prove some form of relationship before you can send an email. So, your salespeople still can phone people. They can send them letters. They can send them brochures, proposals. But before they can use email in the business relationship, they have to have some form of provable relationship. So I'd just like to talk a bit about the second way to obey CASL, and that's to implement a fully compliant system. And we're not going to get into the weeds on this because we want to talk more about the actual record keeping stuff that you signed on for today. But I'm going to try to cover it quickly. So the advantages of a fully compliant program is that you can avoid monetary penalties. We've seen the CRTC investigate somebody and not agree with some of the decisions they made, but if they have a fully compliant program, there was no monetary penalty involved. There was maybe an order to change some things in 6 months, but if you've taken the time to pay attention and properly set up a compliant program, your investigation will go much cleaner. You can also claim a due diligence defense in terms of an employee made a mistake. But if there's no documented system in place or compliance program, it's hard for you to claim that an employee made a mistake because against what? And in all honesty, we've seen that a good compliance program will reduce staff mistakes because part of it is training. So let's talk about the 8 things involved in a compliant compliance program. And this is as CRTC has defined it. So senior management involvement, the more senior the people, the more they believe you're taking it seriously. They want to see a full risk assessment, an audit of current practices. They want to see written corporate policies. A written manual provides proves that the policies exist and become the basis of all staff training. And record keeping, audit trails, sound proof of record keeping allows for proof of consent, what was emailed, when. Record keeping is often the most difficult part of compliance because it involves you to change some of your current practices. And in our assessment, that's been the biggest challenge to CASL compliance.
An example of record keeping that I think a lot of people miss, Derek, is when you modify your subscription pages or your unsubscribe pages, keeping a copy of what it looked like prior to the new version. I think a lot of people just version them and don't keep prior copies. So it leaves you sort of in the dark sometimes to say, well, here's what it looked like on, July 2018 when this person subscribed, now being July 2020, we've updated the form since then, but if you don't have a copy, you're sort of you have a blind spot as to what your form looked like at the time.
Good.
So definitely using some type of repository to keep previous versions of what your forms look like, past contests, if you've made changes from an unsubscribed page to a preference center. And that actually ties into another question we had, Derek, that I'm going to ask you here because it's part of record keeping and part of this discussion. Sure. Is it important to differentiate your preference page from your unsubscribed page? I have opinions on this, but I'd like to hear yours first.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A preference page is different from an unsubscribe. So yes, I would definitely put those as 2 separate links. As we saw on the IT World footer.
Right. So I think the other part that I would just add to that is much like other legislations around making unsubscribes easy, you should be able to unsubscribe from messages without having to authenticate to a preference center, as an example. So being able to differentiate those processes within your application or within your email program is going to be very important. Now, if you don't require authentication to get to your preference center, as an example, you could use it to do the same function. But if you do require some type of login and password to change your preferences, you should make your unsubscribe available without needing additional information beyond the individual's email address.
That is what's meant by 2 clicks, 2 weeks. An unsubscribe is set up that you should be able to get off the list within 2 clicks. With going through a preference center, it's always more than 2 clicks. So I would say keep them separate, list them separate. The other four elements involved in a compliance program, staff training for sure, and then a system to set up for an annual or periodical, whatever you decide yours is, an audit and monitor. So things change. Web forms change. Is there a system in place to audit that your changes to your web form still comply? So exactly what Matt was talking about earlier. And it should include a complaint handling system, so a clear path to a complaint being resolved, and disciplinary action, a position on disciplinary action by the company if CASL is ignored or the mistakes are made. Those like we could do webinars on each one of these topics, but I'm covering them at a high level. So we're going to get more into the record keeping and building lists. So here are the 5 forms of consent. And the first thing you have to do with any individual that you've added to your list, you have to decide what form of consent got them on your list. So you can see that I've highlighted the express one because that's kind of the gold standard. There's no ambiguity, no question in this one. If somebody's filled out a proper form to actually be on your list, that's kind of the high bar.
Yeah, Derek, this ties in nicely to one of the questions we have here as well. That's why I didn't ask it right away because I knew this was coming. But the question is, I find when making purchases with some retailers, I automatically start to receive their weekly promotions. Although there's a paid transaction, they never explicitly opted in to receive future CEMs. And I think I saved this question because this slide I knew was coming. And this is where sort of the implied EBR, which stands for existing business relationship, comes into play. So by making that transaction, by supplying your email address during that transaction, you fall into the implied consent bucket, which is only actually good for a period of 24 months from the time of that purchase. And I think it's important to note that some businesses where you have a high frequency or high rate of return for purchase or repurchase on specific items, setting the bar with an implied consent may be sufficient if you're not having other types of complaint or delivery issues or things like that with your messaging. Whereas, I find a lot of brands want to strive to be in the express consent. So they have to add those types of information we had talked about on their forms during the type of purchase, as well as I would say that's a period where you would probably want to have a checkbox to say, I'm making the purchase, but because you're trying to get express consent, you add a separate checkbox that says, yes, I also want to receive commercial messages. So I think what you're experiencing here is an implied consent transaction. So that's why you're receiving those messages in the future, as opposed to an express consent, maybe, which is what you're expecting as a consumer. So hopefully that answered your question. And we'll continue to get to the other questions. I'm just saving them because I know that some of this comes up later in the discussion. So,
Sure. I'm gonna review at a very high level each of these forms of consent. So in terms of express consent, typically we use web forms. We collect business cards at trade shows. What we do at our trade shows for the Response Marketing Association is we literally have a bowl there, and taped to the bowl is that language that I talked about for required for express consent. And we make sure before anybody puts a card in there that they're clear that that's going to add them to the email list. Again, we have to be able to trace back. So in our CRM, we add 3 new fields. We put in the consent type that we're claiming for that person, and the date that we achieved that consent. If it's not express, then what triggered the implied consent, and the location of the proof. So where is our proof? So if you have those three things in a field and CRTC says to you, you know, why is Matt on your list? You can just go to Matt's in the CRM and look at these three fields, and you know exactly why he's on the list and where the when he got there, so you can track your dates and the location of proof. Existing business relationship is a little different. It is as it says, an existing business relationship of some sort. So you can count on your accounting records, your contracts and proposals, and again, you want to create those three fields in your CRM to know how that person got on there. Matt, do you want to expand on existing business relationship, like where the proof might lie as well?
So the easiest one is any type of transactional proof, whether the individual purchased something from you. You know, there are other pieces of legislation that require you to maintain proof of transaction for an extended period of time for, you know, anti-money laundering, anti-fraud type solutions, those types of things. So you're going to be keeping some of this data anyway. So obviously tracking that is going to be a very important piece. You're going to also want to start tracking, you know, obviously these types of things, the types of consent, date and time, potentially even in the case of a contract, the date of the expiry of the contract, because when it comes to an implied consent, the 24-month period starts counting at the end of the contract. So if someone doesn't renew after being on a contract with you for 2 years, the implied consent starts at the end of that contract. So that's certainly a differentiator to pay attention to. You know, the location of the proof. So, you know, is it in an invoice? Is it in a contract? Even things like, did they download a white paper? So one of the other forms of existing business relationship is the idea of, you know, I've completed a transaction. It doesn't necessarily have to be monetary. Those just tend to be the easiest to track. So even, you know, something like attending a webinar would form an existing business relationship under an implied consent model with that type of restriction on the 24-month window period.
Yeah, we've interpreted that signing up for a white paper or a webinar is a 6-month period. Like if you look in the minutia of the law, they do distinguish that what we call a light touch. So signing up for a webinar or expressing some form of interest, we treat that as 6 months. And if the relationship gets any further, like it gets to the point of a proposal or, you know, even contracts being talked about, it could shift to a 24-month. So I don't know how you interpret that, Matt, but that's certainly the way we've recommended it to our clients.
Yeah, well, I think this is the beauty of any type of legislation. You talk to 6 people, you get 6 different interpretations.
Yeah, of course.
You know, I look at the 6-month period as being that inquiry period, meaning they've requested a quote, they've asked questions around, you know, can you tell me more about your services? You haven't quite reached that business relationship period of the conversation with that individual or with that company. So, you know, within the legislation, they do talk about sort of what that 6-month window is. And you're right, there are points where you have that light touch. You know, I think your definition maybe a little more narrow than mine, but I think at that same point, you know, a lot of this comes down to what the business goals are, and it is sort of fluid based on each client you're talking to.
Correct. And again, we're talking minimal compliance versus best practices. So yeah, good distinction. Somebody asked earlier, does this apply to charities? Are the rules different for a nonprofit? And yes, they are. So existing non-business relationship is predominantly for associations and not-for-profits. And there are a couple things in the regulations that allow if an email is sent specifically for donations, there's a wider berth of permission. But if you let anything else creep in, so if Sick Kids is sending an update on, you know, a new program, that's not strictly a donation request, and they would require to meet one of these standards of existing non-business relationship or express consent in order to send that email. So there's a slightly wider berth for non-business, but I have had a lot of not-for-profits say, well, it doesn't apply to us, and that is not so at all. CASL definitely applies to not-for-profit, but they're cut. They give them a little wider berth when it comes to consent.
Yeah, and it really depends on the narrow type of messaging you're sending around fundraising versus even promotion of an event or an individual. So those are, it's almost better to err on the side of caution in many cases, because consumers aren't going to know the difference. Consumers aren't going to basically, look at it and say, well, this is sick kids, so I'm going to just not be mad that they're sending me unsolicited email, even though it's a fundraising message. I'm certainly not pointing the finger at sick kids. It's just the example that Derek started with. Yeah. So, the idea being, very narrow fundraising messages have exemptions around some of the types of consent, whereas, general messaging certainly would be considered in the CRM or the CEM bucket that needs to have all of the unsubscribed, consent, postal address, etc., contact info.
Good. Cognizant of time, conspicuously published seems to be the most controversial one, and again, it's a case-by-case basis how you collect and what you consider conspicuously published. The CRTC reserves that right to judge. So we've set this program up for several clients, and it seems to be effective. You search online to confirm the title and role, because one of the criteria of conspicuously published is you know the role. Take a screen grab and call it. In this case, I just went to LinkedIn. I could see that I'm the managing director of Newport Thomson, so you now know my role. So you'd call that Derek Lackey 1. And then you search online to confirm an email address is publicly displayed. In some cases, it's clean. It's right there on LinkedIn. You can just open the contact info form and capture the title and their email address all with one screen grab. And in this case, where I had to go to the website to get it and see that it's publicly displayed, you take a screen grab and call it Derek Lackey 2. Now I can add that person to my, well, first of all, create a file on your server called CP proof, which is conspicuously published proof, and then you place these two screen grabs in that folder. So if you've marked me in your CRM as conspicuously published, the date at which you found and took those screen grabs, and the location of the proof, CP file, you can know exactly how to trace back when CRTC says, why is Derek Lackey on your list? You can go to my CRM and you can go, oh, I see, he's conspicuously published. We captured him on July 29th, 2018, and his proof is in the CP proof file on our server.
The one boundary that I would put around this is really the idea that you're supposed to be targeting and sending messages to individuals that are going to be interested, and it's relevant to their role, function, or business. Here we have the similar idea, and at the same time, I would also put the boundary of don't just subscribe them to your newsletter. That's going to violate the terms of service of most of your email service providers. Use this as an opportunity to send a one-off communication to the individual, get to know them, ask them.
An invite, yeah.
Using the conspicuously published consent model to do that. Don't just be like, hey, you're now going to get my daily newsletter because your email was available and it's not relevant to that individual. So the definition for this is also fairly narrow. So if you're going to be looking at this, definitely pay attention to what the individual's responsibilities are. If you don't know, you could reach out to the individual to see if they're interested. As an example, I get tons of messages based on my title that are completely irrelevant to what I do, but because people assume based on my business title, I would be interested. These types of things would fall outside of the scope of conspicuously published. The other thing is if somebody has a notice on their email that says, do not email me unrelated to this website or specific questions, you have to respect their request to not receive commercial messages as well.
Correct. Correct. So again, I didn't want to get too stuck in this, because again, each one of these types of consent could take up a webinar on its own. We take the position for the most part that personal relationships are not commercial electronic messages. And I know, Matt, you can make a comment on this.
Yeah, I think
but we recommend for the most part, just don't use personal email for business.
Yeah, well, it's the same sort of general idea, right? I can email a friend and say, I have a new promotion for my business. As a friend, I thought you'd be interested because obviously you know this person. You have to have
Right.
proof of, friendship if you ever get challenged on that. But at the same time, temper that with don't abuse your friends, right? They're not going to stick around to be your friends if you continue to sort of abuse their relationship with them. So pick and choose who you want to talk to about specific things. Certainly don't subscribe them to your newsletter. I've had lots of people in the past export my email from LinkedIn and then try to use personal relationship as a consent type to say, well, we're connected on LinkedIn, so we're friends. I have 1,800 connections on LinkedIn. They're not all necessarily my friends and meet the requirement for personal relationship. So definitely temper who you're talking to, because you don't want to burn your personal relationships that way either.
Yeah, I tried to make the case with the enforcement team that if I go in and check my email contacts, because I've been involved in the Direct Marketing Association for years, which is the predecessor to the Response Marketing Association. I've actually connected with over 5,000 people in the marketing community on LinkedIn. That does not give me permission to download that file. That would have both their role and their email address in one spot and claim them as conspicuously published. As the enforcement team looked at me and said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And they didn't say anything more about it other than I wouldn't do that if I were you. So they have not yet put out guidance on social media and how it applies to CASL. They have promised it, and we're looking forward to seeing that when it comes out. This, to me, is the biggest breach of any compliance program. Most clients don't have a manual, electronic messaging policies and procedures manual. Again, never had to have one in the past. So why now? Well, why now is because CASL has become the law here in Canada. So I would suggest that you spend some time and attention to what your policies and procedures are, document them so that your staff know where to look, and use the policy and the procedure manual as the basis for your training. So this is one that we used for the Response Marketing Association themselves, and we used it for Agency 59 as well, which is a direct response agency here in Toronto. And this is kind of a sample of the kinds of things that should be included. And it's different for the wonderful thing about the law, and the confusing thing about the law, is that it's not prescriptive. It doesn't give you the exact headings and sections and what policies you need to talk about. It allows you to be free to, express your industry differences, your cultural differences. You can design your manual whatever way you want, but this kind of outline is at least a beginning point for us. and then we customize from there when we deal with a client.
And what's great about this template, once you sort of start, you can take this and you can add in a GDPR section, a CCPA
Correct.
section, a PIPEDA section, an Australia Spam Act section, a Brazil privacy legislation section, depending on what your organization is targeting.
We've gone the other route, Matt, where we've had a privacy and security manual, and the CASL section, the electronic messaging section, is one of the sections of the privacy and security manual. So we've done it both ways, but you're right. This is definitely can expand and make sure that your your data subject requests are being, what's our policy around how we manage those, and you can get really into the minutia, right?
Yeah, Derek, we have a question around, do you provide this template? I know this is part of what Newport Thomson provides to their clients and you engage with.
Yeah.
I don't think you supply this template without some type of formal engagement with your clients, right?
I don't, but I have included this slide. The slide is in there. But keep in mind, folks, it really is just an example, and our manual for a different client in a different industry might look substantially different. Some of the things are fundamental as to what is electronic messaging and the role. Basic stuff like that is common to every manual we do, but a lot of this is customized to the company. So to answer your question directly, yeah, we definitely prefer, the law is not a prescriptive law, and no good one ever is. So we do prefer to talk with a company about what theirs might look like, and but I will definitely leave this slide in when we send you the copy of these slides. Boy, that was good timing, Matt. It's 11:57. So
we probably have time for a couple more quick questions. If there's anyone,
we do.
If you have any more, please put them in the chat box or the question box, please. I think, hopefully we conveyed to you that, the law has structure and it has sort of requirements. There are some great examples. I know one of the questions earlier we talked about in regards that was asked was, what type of proof do you need to provide? There is a full sort of available audit, if you will, from the Office of the Privacy Commission on one of the CASL cases. I believe it was the CompuFinder case, where they kind of looked at the different types of proof that were provided. And they talked about some of the different pieces where they agreed that the proof was enough and where they thought the proof wasn't enough. So certainly, Derek, we'll find that and we can share that link out later with the audience. But I think that gives a really solid idea of what the different enforcement agencies look for, including the CRTC, the Office of the Privacy Commission, and the Competition Bureau as needed, depending on what part of the law is being investigated at that point.
I will use the last minute to plug. Matt has invited Stephen Haroon, who is the head of all enforcement for CRTC, to do a fireside chat during our email summit on September 22nd. So if you're interested in being part of that, Matt is going to kind of get into some of these issues with CRTC and some of the minutia with Stephen, and you'll hear it directly from the horse's mouth. And you can find that at emailsummit.ca. There's a full description of the conference. It's a day-long conference, and one of our featured speakers is an armchair chat between Matt and Stephen. So thank you very much for attending today. I hope this content was valuable to you, and you had learned something. And thank you. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. And yes, you have my consent to use my email address.
Thanks very much, Derek, for having me.
Thank you, Matt.